This is the Pennsylvania Independent Weekly Podcast. I'm Eric Boehm. Today I'm joined by Maurice McTigue, former member of the New Zealand Parliament and currently the Vice President at the Marcatus Center at George Mason University, where he is the Director of the Government Accountability Project. Mr. McTigue was recently the guest of the Commonwealth Foundation for a Policies and Principles breakfast, where he discussed strategies for dealing with state government spending in a way that can maximize transparency, accountability, and investment.
The most effective economic development policy around the world is to focus on what makes it attractive for investment to occur in your particular community, to take away all of those dissatisfiers and the delays that make it unattractive, because if you get the investment, that investment creates jobs, those jobs create prosperity. And that formula never ever changes. It's always in that sequence. So you don't have to worry about the jobs or the prosperity, you just have to worry about attracting the investment. And if the policy approach was to look at making your community more attractive than anywhere else, then you'd find that those jobs would flow.
When you were a member of Parliament in New Zealand in the early 1990s, the country was in a pretty dire financial situation. It had been running a deficit for more than 2 decades. What did you do then that has helped turn things around?
By 1992, we'd gone into surplus for the first time in 23 years. So we passed a law that was called the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And that law said that governments in future, if they were going to go into deficit, first and foremost had to go to the Parliament and ask permission to go into deficit. And asking for permission, they had to explain what caused that problem, something that they obviously failed to do, how long the government would be in deficit, how much debt would accumulate over that period, and how they were going to repay that debt. Now, the result of that and those conditions is that until the world financial crisis hit last year, New Zealand had never ever been in deficit again. And my guess is that it will be back into surpluses again within 18 months, and it will still be applying that new culture, which is debt and deficits are bad and should only be extraordinary events, not ordinary events.
One of the other things that you had mentioned this morning is that we should consider government programs not as institutions, but rather as tools. Because if an institution becomes broken, we want to spend more time and money trying to fix it and make it work better. But if we were to consider government programs as tools, then you would argue that the outcome is what becomes most important there. And it's easier to scrap one thing or change plans if one tool isn't getting the job done, and look to a different program or a different tool to accomplish what you're trying to do. Is that right?
Well, I think that probably what we haven't done in governments well at all is that we haven't identified what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. And the easiest way of describing an outcome is the outcome is actually the public benefit. So if you're dealing with homelessness, then the public benefit is that there are less people who are homeless. There are a variety of different things that you might use to deal with that. You might decide that what we need to do is build more low-income housing. If that doesn't work, you've got to ask questions about why have we still got the same level of homelessness if we built all this low-income housing. And what many places have found is that it's not an absence of low-income housing that causes homelessness, it's mental health problems. So that institution of creating low-income housing is something that you should drop, and you should actually now look at how do we deal with the mental health problems of these people, and then you solve the homelessness problem.
But anytime that you start to talk about cutting government programs, even ones that don't work, that's going to involve firing public employees. And there's always going to be an opposition to that when you are, talking about laying off workers, whether it's from members of the legislature who are worried about political repercussions or whether it's from the public sector unions that have become very powerful, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country as a whole. So is it realistic to expect politicians to be willing to cut certain programs and to look for ways to save money by removing tools that are no longer producing the outcomes that we're looking for?
Through the democratic process, we choose politicians to be our leaders. It's not unreasonable that we would expect them to lead. If something's not working, then we would expect them to do the appropriate thing. And if you're doing activities, or you're involved in activities that don't work, then you should stop doing it. Governments do not exist to provide employment for civil servants. Governments exist to provide needed services for the public and the community at large. And governments should, of course, be good employers, but they're not there to provide jobs for civil servants. So if their activity is redundant, then good leadership would say cease. And that means terminating all of the other things that go with it. So if you wander around the streets of this city, I'll guarantee that you can't find a business that makes buggy whips any longer because we don't actually use them any longer. Those people got deployed to some other kind of activities, and exactly the same if people have to leave this activity in the public sector, then they'll be deployed somewhere else, maybe within the public sector, but maybe also in the private sector. That's just the world as it is.
We've got a big election coming up here in November. We're going to have a new governor in Pennsylvania. If you could give one or two pieces of advice to whoever the next governor is going to be, what would it be?
The first piece of advice would be to focus very much on investment in Pennsylvania. What could they do to make it more attractive for investors to come in? What are the barriers that they could take away? How quickly could they allow investment to occur by taking away things that delay that investment? So that would be number one. And if they did that and did that well, then you would get jobs and prosperity. My second piece of advice would be to them to stop spending money on things that don't work. The real challenge there is that first and foremost you have to find what works and what doesn't work. So that would require a major review of government operations and look at the things that were very effective at producing results and benefits for the public and eliminate those things that produce no benefits for the public.
Last night, I believe you met with a number of politicians from the General Assembly here in Pennsylvania. What did you talk about, and what were they most interested in?
They were most interested in the ideas around the equation that produces jobs and prosperity. And I think that I saw some lights coming on in terms of people thinking about, well, it's not just about tax rates, but it's about how quickly can you get approval for a new investment to occur. What are the constraints that we put on it? What are the things that are making it more attractive for somebody to invest in Virginia or in Taiwan than here in Pennsylvania? They found that very interesting. And quite a lot of interest in something that I've been focusing on for the last few years, and that is giving the public a better picture of exactly what the debt situation is of their different governments, requiring that budget statements actually also have to include information on debt and liabilities that the government has. That when there's a bond issue by a school board or a local government, that not only do they have to put out the information on what the bond is about and what it's going to fund, but also the current level of debt that that organization has, the maturity of that debt, and what it's costing to fund it at this stage. Then I think we, the public, can make better decisions about, I want to have to pay for this additional debt, or I don't want to have to pay for this additional debt. One of the things that I found surprising in recent months, going around the states in the United States, is how many citizens don't actually know how much debt their state has. Because there's a balanced budget requirement, most people think that they have no debt, but there's a lot of below-the-line items that governments spend money on that you don't know about. Having to disclose that, I think, is a really good thing to do.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today. That's Maurice McTigue, former Member of Parliament from New Zealand and currently the Vice President of the Marcatus Center at George Mason University. Maurice, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here once again.
This is Eric Boehm for the Pennsylvania Independent Podcast. Thanks for listening.